how God moves in your life in the future when you're filled with the Holy Spirit and led by the Holy Spirit, it might not be the way you think it's going to happen. See, I don't know about you. I can only share with you from my own experiences, and then really by sharing from my own experiences, I am sharing about your experiences, because I'm no different than you, and you're no different than me. We're members of the human race. Red, yellow, black, white. We're all the same in God's sight. We all deal with the same issues in the course of our lives. I've been guilty of getting ahead of God and coloring outside the lines and beginning to anticipate how God is going to do certain things when God never promised me that he would do things that particular way. So you're either dealing with that now, the temptation of getting ahead of God and putting words in God's mouth, being tempted with that, or there will come a time in your life when you will be tempted to put words in God's mouth and begin to think that he's going to do certain things the way you think he's going to do them, when God, in fact, didn't consult you about the how and the why and the way in which he was going to fulfill what he promised. But remember this: God promises something to Paul, and now it's up to God to deliver the circumstances, the details of how that promise will be fulfilled. And this is where we begin to transition. We begin to think about ourselves in terms of the things that God has promised you, the things that God promised to do in your life. And many times what we begin to do is we begin to put words in God's mouth. But God, you said. God, you promised me. God, you told me. And then things don't happen the way, not that God told you that they would happen that way. So you began to tell God the way he needed to do what he told you he would do. And that's when we get into trouble. And because we've gotten way ahead of God and we put words in God's mouth, we begin to think that the way that God is going to fulfill that promise is a certain way. And far be it from anybody, don't you get in my way as I'm on God's way. And you can miss the fact that God delivers what he promises, says what he means what he says, is always on time. If God has promised it, it will come to reality. But what you have to be careful of, what I have to be careful of, what we have to be careful of, is putting words in God's mouth that he never said. Anticipating that God is going to fulfill what he said he was going to do in ways that we think it's going to happen. Because a spirit-filled, spirit-led person, their hope is not in how God's going to fulfill his promise. Their hope is in the promise giver, the Lord himself. Many people have gotten themselves into huge trouble. You might be in the thick of it right now where you need to back up the truck. Many people have gotten themselves into a heap of trouble, and they've spent years and perhaps a large portion of their life trying to orchestrate things to happen the way that they think it needs to happen, when God says, would you please forget about backing up the truck. Take your hands off the steering wheel and please let me drive. God told Paul, I'm going to take you to Rome. Paul didn't know exactly how that was going to happen. He didn't know that the first part of that was being escorted by 470 Roman soldiers. There's a lot of freedom in our lives when we take our hands off the wheel and let God drive. It's a lot of freedom in our lives when we understand that, listen, what God has promised, he'll deliver. He'll never be late. He's always on time. He says what he means, delivers what he promises. You can trust God. Leave the consequences to him. Trust God and stop trying to figure out the how and the why and the what. Because ultimately speaking, the big why in all of our lives is the glory of God. And that's all that really matters. The life of Paul is a microcosm. It's one of what should be and one of what is the example of every Christian's life. that God puts a calling on your life to glorify God. And the ways that that happens in our family lives, in our businesses, in our houses of worship, in our neighborhood, the neighborhood that we might live in, all of that stuff, the way that happens is up to God. So the objective of a Christian is to let God drive. Leave the consequences to Him. Stop thinking that God's objective in your life is to fulfill things in a way that's pleasing to you. If your endeavor is to be pleasing to God and to please Him, no matter how God fulfills what He promises, will be okay with you. Because your contentedness and your satisfaction and your fulfillment is not just in the journey, but it's in the destination. And it's in the starting point. Jesus is at the beginning of your life. Jesus will be there at the end. Let Jesus be present, guiding you without resistance all along the way. God is sovereign. He means what He says what He means, delivers what He promises, and will never be late. You just need to trust that all of that's true on your journey of obedient surrender to Jesus.